The legends rarely tell the same story twice. This is just one of them. What if the child in your home is not yours anymore? Not gone, not missing, still there, just not the same. Before anyone said the word monster, before anyone spoke of curses, before the old stories were written down, there was a fear. Not of war, not of plague, not of the dark forest beyond the village, a different fear. The fear that the child in your home was no longer your child. That something had come in the night, quietly, without a sound, and taken what was yours, leaving something else behind, something that looked the same at first, but not for long. They called it a changeling. Long before medicine, before psychology, before anyone had words for difference, illness, or disability, Europe had another explanation. If a child changed, if it cried too much, if it did not grow, if it looked wrong, if it moved strangely, if it seemed too clever or not clever enough, then perhaps it was never the child at all. Perhaps the fairies had come, or demons, or trolls, or spirits from beneath the earth. And in the cradle, where your baby should have been, they left one of their own. A substitute, a copy, a thing wearing the shape of someone you loved. That is what made the changeling so terrifying. Not that it was strange, but that it was familiar. Its face was known. Its place in the house was known. Its mother's arms still held it. Its father still looked into its eyes, and yet something was wrong. The stories are old, older than many kingdoms, older than the churches that later tried to silence them. They spread across Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Germany, Scandinavia, Poland, the Isle of Man, Cornwall, and beyond. Different names, different spirits, different rules, but always the same dread. A child is left alone. A mother looks away. A blessing is forgotten. A baptism is delayed. A cradle is left unguarded. And something enters. When the child is found again, it is not as it was. Sometimes it is sickly, thin, always hungry, always crying. Sometimes it does not grow. Sometimes it stares with an expression too old for a child's face. Sometimes it seems to know things it should not know. Sometimes it laughs when no one is there. Sometimes it sings. Sometimes it dances when it believes it is alone. And sometimes it is silent, too silent, watching, waiting, as if it is listening for someone beyond the walls. In Irish folklore, the changeling was often a fairy child, but not always. Sometimes it was said to be an old fairy, ancient, withered, and near death, placed into a human home to be fed, warmed, and cared for in comfort. A burden disguised as a blessing. And in poor households, where every mouth mattered, that idea carried horror. Because the changeling was always hungry. That detail returns again and again. It drinks too much milk. It consumes too much food. It gives nothing back. It takes and takes and takes, as if its hunger is not human hunger at all, but something bottomless, something supernatural, something that can never be satisfied. And in a world where survival depended on what a family could carry, grow, save, and endure, that kind of child would not only be feared, it would be resented. That is where the legend becomes darker, because the changeling was never just a monster in a story, it was also an explanation, and explanations can be dangerous. A child who could not speak, a child who could not walk, a child whose body developed strangely, a child whose mind seemed distant, a child who screamed through the night, a child who would not meet the eyes of others, a child who moved in ways people did not understand. In another age, such a child might be seen not as sick, not as different, not as disabled, but stolen, replaced. And once that belief took root, anything could follow. Because if the child was not truly yours, if it was a fairy or a demon or a thing from elsewhere, then what was done to it could be justified. And so, across the old stories, we find the rituals, the tests, the cruel little ceremonies meant to force the truth into the open. One of the strangest appears again and again: eggshells. A parent is told to boil water in eggshells or cook some absurd meal inside them, as though performing a piece of nonsense. And when the changeling sees it, it laughs or speaks and reveals itself. "I am older than the forest," it says in one version. "I have seen the acorn before the oak, but never this." That is enough. The child has betrayed itself. And sometimes, in the stories, the moment it speaks, the spell breaks. The fairies rush in, the real child is returned, the substitute vanishes. A neat ending, a comforting ending. But the old world was rarely so merciful. Other methods were worse. Threatening the changeling with fire, holding it over flames, placing it near an oven, beating it, whipping it, starving it, forcing suffering onto a body believed not to be human, as if pain could drive out a spirit, as if cruelty could restore love. There are records, not just folk tales, of children burned, drowned, beaten and killed because someone believed they were changelings. That is the part the legend does not hide. This was not harmless superstition. This was fear made physical. In Ireland, the danger was always near. A child admired too openly could be taken. A new bride could be taken. A new mother could be taken. Beauty itself was dangerous. To be noticed was to be vulnerable. The fairies envied what humans had: a healthy baby, a strong young woman, a human life still warm with possibility. And they would steal it. Sometimes through the window, sometimes from the cradle, sometimes in the hours between dusk and dawn when the house was weakest and the threshold thin. To protect against them, people turned to iron, prayers, blessings, open scissors, red ribbons, holy water, constant watchfulness. The cradle became a border, the nursery became a battlefield, and every sleeping child became a risk. In Scandinavia, trolls were blamed. In Germany, the devil. Water spirits, dwarfs, cornfield demons. In Poland, the mamuna. In Wales, a grotesque little thing that would shriek, bite, and show cunning beyond its years. In the Isle of Man, a child left laughing alone in an empty room was enough to suggest it kept company with something unseen. Everywhere the same structure. A family senses a change. The child is no longer right. Someone older, wiser, or more superstitious is consulted. A test is proposed. The child is forced to reveal itself. Then comes the question: what now? Some tales claim the true child comes back. Some say the changeling is reclaimed. Some say nothing returns at all. Only the substitute disappears, leaving absence behind. And perhaps that is worse, because then the family learns what no superstition can fix. The child is gone, and it is not coming back. But even that may not be the deepest layer of the changeling legend. Because underneath the fairies, underneath the trolls, underneath the devils and demons and shadows, there is something human. A parent sees their child changing. The future they imagined begins to collapse. The child does not become what was hoped for. It becomes something unknown. And the mind reaches for a story, not because the story is true, but because it is bearable. Because "my child was stolen" is easier sometimes than "my child is suffering." Because "this is not my child" can be easier than facing a grief that has no funeral. And so the changeling becomes more than a creature. It becomes a container for fear, for disappointment, for guilt, for exhaustion, for poverty, for the brutal mathematics of survival. In pre-industrial Europe, a child who could not work, could not develop, or required endless care could endanger an entire family's future. That does not excuse the violence, but it explains why the legend endured. It gave shape to impossible decisions. It turned suffering into a story, and stories are easier to pass on than shame. Some modern scholars believe changeling tales were early explanations for conditions people did not understand. Autism, Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, developmental delay, metabolic disorders, failure to thrive. A child who seemed different could be cast into the old pattern. Too quiet, too strange, too hungry, too brilliant, too delayed, too difficult, not ours. Taken, changed. The folklore bent itself to fit the child. And that is why the descriptions vary so much. Because the changeling was never one thing. It was whatever frightened the family most. That is what gives the legend its terrible flexibility. It can explain anything. And when a belief can explain anything, it can justify anything. There are famous cases where this belief left folklore and entered history. Bridget Cleary, in Ireland, was not a child but an adult woman. After a short illness, her husband and others became convinced she had been replaced, that the real Bridget had been taken. What followed was not ritual, it was murder. And even after her death, they claimed they had not killed Bridget, only the thing left behind. That is how complete the belief could become. Not doubt, not suspicion, certainty. And certainty, when paired with fear, is one of the most dangerous forces in the world. But the changeling legend does not survive only because of its cruelty. It survives because it touches something deeper, something older. The fear of substitution. The fear that love can be interrupted and replaced. The fear that the familiar face might no longer contain the familiar soul. It is the same fear found in stories of possession, of doubles, of mirrors, of bodies inhabited by the wrong thing. The changeling belongs to that family of nightmares. Because identity, in these stories, is fragile. It can be taken, and the theft may not even be noticed until it is too late. That may be why the changeling still haunts the modern world, not in cradles, not in fairy rings, but in language, in suspicion, in the terrible ease with which people still say of the disabled, the neurodivergent, the mentally ill, that they are difficult, unnatural, burdensome, wrong. The old myth survives whenever a human being is treated as though they are not fully human, whenever difference is mistaken for intrusion, whenever care is replaced by fear. And yet, there is another way to read the changeling, a quieter one, a sadder one. What if the changeling story is not really about monsters? What if it is about grief? Not the grief of death, but the grief of changed expectations, the grief of the child you thought you would have and the child who arrives instead. A child still real, still human, still worthy of love, but different. Different enough to break the story the parents had already written in their minds. And perhaps folklore, lacking medicine, lacking science, lacking language, turned that grief into fairies, turned it into theft, turned it into exchange, turned it into a supernatural crime, because ordinary pain was too shapeless to hold. If that is true, then the changeling is not merely a monster of old Europe. It is a monument to what happens when fear fills the space where understanding should be. A warning, not about fairies, about ourselves, about what people do when they cannot bear what they do not understand. And maybe that is why the changeling is still unsettling, because unlike the dragon, or the ghost, or the demon at the crossroads, the changeling does not come from somewhere else. It comes from the home, from the cradle, from the family, from the place where love should be safest. It asks a terrible question. If the person before you no longer matches what you hoped for, will you still recognize them as your own? Or will you search for a story that allows you to turn away? In the old tales, the changeling is defeated by trickery, by fire, by revelation. But in the modern world, the only thing that truly defeats it is recognition. To look at the child, the broken child, the strange child, the hungry child, the silent child, the difficult child, and say, "You are not stolen. You are not cursed. You are not a substitute. You are here. You are real. And you are mine." But the old stories do not end there, because in some of them, the human child taken away is never harmed. It grows among the fairies. It lives another life. It forgets, or is forgotten. And the changeling, too, may forget what it is. It may simply live as human, which means the boundary was never clear, not fully. The fairy child becomes the human child becomes the fairy child, and the categories begin to dissolve. Perhaps that is the final unease at the heart of the legend. Not that a replacement occurred, but that the replacement may not be entirely separate from what it replaced. That identity itself may be unstable, that belonging may be more fragile than blood. That family may not be determined by origin alone. And once that thought enters, the changeling changes again. No longer only a monster, no longer only a stolen thing, but a symbol of how uncertain human identity has always been. So if you hear the word changeling today, you may think of fairies, of old Europe, of folklore whispered by candlelight. But beneath those stories lies something darker, a history of fear, a history of children misunderstood, a history of difference made monstrous, and a question that still remains. When someone changes, or seems to, what do we do with that fear? Do we turn them into a story, or do we learn how to see them? Because long before science, before diagnosis, before there were names for the things people feared, there was a cradle, a child, a household holding its breath, and a whisper in the dark, "This is not your child." They called it a changeling, and for centuries they believed it. And in the end, sometimes the monster was never in the cradle. It was in the fear, in the silence, in the story people chose to believe. They called it the changeling. This is Voices of Mimir, and this was the child that was never yours.